We're going to begin that chapter, and while you're turning there, let me just remind you that when the ladies are beginning their new Wednesday night study, we're beginning a new study here in the auditorium on lessons from James, and the dates of those lessons are on this yellow sheet, and if you'd like to pick one up, I'll leave those right up here on the front seat, and so whenever you want to, you can pick those up and be aware of what's upcoming on Wednesday nights with those lessons from James. Matthew 8. I think what I'll do is start off, and we're going to try to cover verses 1 through 17 this morning. So if you'll follow along, I'll read verses 1 through 17 as we get started. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately, he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." And Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to that one, 'Come,' and he comes. And I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with the word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases." So we're going to be looking at this particular section of Matthew 8, and of course it's not the only place in Matthew, but it sort of gets into a little bit more detail with Jesus' healing ministry. So Jesus, in the first section, heals this man with leprosy. He starts off by coming down from the mountainside, and large crowds followed him. So he didn't just speak to a large crowd on the Sermon on the Mount, but when he finished and he got ready to leave, there's still lots of people following him. One of the things that's interesting, if you pay close attention in the Gospels, there's so much of Jesus' public ministry where crowds are just constantly following him. Constantly. And what's interesting, two things flow out of that. One, there are fascinating, what I want to call healing moments, where someone in the crowd, the large crowds that's following him, someone will come up to Jesus where he will reach out and heal them. And the crowd gets to see that, or at least those that can see it. Then also emerging from the crowd sometimes are some of the religious leaders there to test and to challenge Jesus. So the crowds constantly are wanting a piece of him, so to speak. He doesn't get very much rest from the crowds. They're crowding him and they're pressing him. They need things from him. They engage him. Sometimes they're very there's a large level of conflict as he engages some people coming out of the crowds. It's just a very important part of Jesus' ministry, that as you read the Gospels, you're aware of his interaction with the crowds. Now, it's interesting that this word that Matthew uses for the man with leprosy can be interpreted leprosy. In fact, a lot of the tradition of translation is leprosy, although it's also a word which was used for various diseases affecting the skin. It wasn't just leprosy, but it's easier, and we're used to just leprosy, so that's typically the translation of the word. But you've got this man with leprosy. And here's what's interesting. Because of the Jewish understanding of someone with a skin disease, and indeed if it is leprosy, these were the untouchables. And one of the things, and we don't, I didn't really think about tracing this through Matthew at this point, but we certainly could. In the Gospels, Jesus is pictured as his life not only intersecting with, but literally touching the untouchable. And there's a fascinating body of literature and people who have written stuff on Jesus' ministry being sort of, let's see, what word can I use? Jesus' ministry in that microcosm of a moment where he touches the untouchable. Some people see that as a complete picture of what he is all about. That he comes to this earth, he's seeking those that are lost. He's seeking to let the people out on the fringes know they can be part of the kingdom. There's a whole list of those. And Luke especially starts just giving you a whole list of those. But also, Jesus wants the people who are the untouchables to realize that they can be touched, and they can be accepted, and they can be part of the kingdom. And so it's interesting, and Matthew at this point doesn't make much of it, except he's just a man with leprosy. So he came and knelt down before Jesus, and he said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." Now in this episode, and in the next one, with the faith of the Centurion, there's a part of the story, those two stories, we don't know. We don't know how these guys understood Jesus' ability to heal them. Maybe someone told them. There are ways in which they've gotten this information that Jesus is able to do that. And they go to him expecting things to happen. And so he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Oh, here's another thing too. In the Gospels, there's this neat category of the clean and the unclean. Now, from one perspective, the clean and the unclean has to do with ceremonial and ritual purity from Old Testament background. But then on the other hand, it's interesting that these spirits and these demons that Jesus cast out, sometimes they are called evil spirits, sometimes they're called unclean spirits. And it's a fascinating thing because it's tapping into this concept of the contrast between clean and unclean, and yet it's going much deeper than that, because if you'll look at what the unclean spirits would cause people to do, and Jesus is going to address these in different points in his ministry. And so then it raises the awareness, and think about this, that one of the significant aspects of portraying the whole ministry of Jesus is this insight. Or maybe it's this question. What happens to you when Jesus touches your life? If you think you're an unclean person and you're unfit, and whatever other words that you want to use, what happens when Jesus touches your life? Yeah, Bill?
We talk about the stain of sin and being cleansed from that. But I also see the comparison between the unclean spirits and angels.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Good comparison.
Two realms of spiritual beings. Those that are good and those that are evil.
Yeah, because remember I think twice already we've hit this idea of the role of angels in Matthew. And that's wonderful contrast. That you have these unclean evil spirits, they're in the spiritual realm. And here's another thing too. Remember how early on we're going through Matthew and early in the story, boom, all of a sudden there's something on the Holy Spirit. Like, whoa, where did this come from? And Matthew doesn't give us a chapter giving us a whole theology of the Holy Spirit. He just keeps on moving in the story. Boom, there's the Holy Spirit. Well, and it's fascinating that some other things just kind of hit you in the face all of a sudden. And this thing about demon possession and unclean spirits, just like the angels. We're going along, boom, there's the angels. Well, so these other spirits, evil spirits, unclean spirits, they're part of the story as Matthew tells it, relating to the whole ministry of Jesus. And again, I wish we had a whole chapter kind of as an aside. Okay, who are these guys? Where did they come from? What are they up to? Answering all of our questions. I'm always fascinated how Scripture, and if you're looking at the Gospels, the ministry of Jesus wasn't written to accommodate all of our questions and everything that we're interested in knowing. It just seems like that the writers, they're not really going that direction, not interested as much as we are in our questions. But here's, as I pointed out, this is critical. The willingness of Jesus and this significant theme of his willingness. I am willing. And it raises another question if you're a disciple. What is Jesus willing to do for me? What can I ask for and what is he willing to do? That's a fascinating question, isn't it? Because some reason, this gentleman with the leprosy, he knew where he could go. And he said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Just a strong, straightforward statement of belief in what Jesus could do. And he said, well, I'm willing. He said, okay, be clean. And then it makes you raise the next question about what does it mean to be clean? In what sense are disciples clean? And of course, when you tie that to Jesus, the shedding of his blood to take care of the stain of sin itself, then you can begin to see the background for this. Okay, let's look at the next one. Matthew moves from the man with leprosy being healed to the faith of the centurion. So Jesus, he had entered Capernaum and a centurion came to him. Now this is interesting because centurions typically were of what nationality? They were Roman, weren't they? Here, this is interesting because a lot of times people say, well, the Gospel of Luke is the one that's all about the good news going over everywhere, and it's about the inclusive appeal of the gospel. Well, Matthew has his way of doing it too. This is one of those. A Roman centurion comes to Jesus. Really? Okay. And then I'll point, and we'll come to it in a little bit. Notice the other inclusive language that he uses about the appeal to the gospel. This is down in verse 11. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So coming from the east and the west is another inclusive reference to, doesn't matter where you come from, but this good news is going to be spread as far as the east is from the west, and you can be part of the kingdom. So you have a Roman centurion, and then you have this statement by Jesus. So it's not just for the Jews. Some writers who write on the Gospel of Matthew make this point, and remember, I think it was way back in the second lesson, we talked about playing a little bit of detective and thinking about, okay, the church that Matthew's writing to, and we don't know exactly where it was located, but there are hints in the Gospel of Matthew that Matthew's telling the story of Jesus to address some current problems in the church at that time. That's a fascinating thing to think about. It's not just throwing out a story, there's a purpose to this. not only who Jesus is and what his ministry is, but also helping Christians solidify their faith at such an early date, if Matthew's written, say, 65 AD. So it's about 30 years after Jesus has left the scene. And it looks like that the early Jewish Christians still struggled with this idea of the inclusive nature of the gospel. And that really doesn't surprise us. I mean, that's their background. That's all they've been used to, that the Jews are God's people. We are it. We're glad we're it. We're glad you're not part of us. I mean, all that mindset that went with that. And now they've got to change all of that. Well, I'm not surprised that you have in Matthew, apparently written to the Jewish church, such an emphasis at different places through the gospel that the good news is for everybody, not just those of you who have Jewish background. And so you can see this unfolding. So this centurion comes to Jesus and he's asking for help. He said, "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Now we don't know the background, we don't know why, he doesn't go into detail. But this is interesting because sometimes instead of the individual asking Jesus and saying, "Can you come? Can you help?" and Jesus would say, "Well, what do you need?" Jesus kind of takes the a little bit further step initiative here and says, "Shall I come and heal him?" And the centurion, instead of saying, "Well, yeah, that's why I came. Hop in my chariot, let's go." No. He has this fantastic response that at first doesn't sound like it's a yes. Jesus is amazed by his response. And let's look at it because Jesus is going to say something about it that becomes very crucial in understanding kind of one of the major themes throughout the whole Gospel of Matthew. Centurion said, "Well, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. But just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself, I'm a man under authority and with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And then to that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." And Jesus is amazed. He said, "I tell you, truly I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." Two or three things come to coalesce here at this moment. One is the idea of Jesus' authority. In the Gospel of Matthew, at several times, the religious leaders question that authority. Who do you think you are? He ends up being charged with blasphemy because he speaks with that authority, and they don't approve of it. The authority of Jesus is behind the giving of the Great Commission, last chapter. So much in the Gospel of Matthew is founded on this authority of Jesus. Bill?
There seems to be a mutual respect here. Jesus respects this man's authority as a Roman soldier, basically a policeman in front of him. And yet this man also respects the authority of Jesus. "I'm not worthy for you to come to my house."
I know. And again, we don't know with the gentleman with the leprosy, somehow he knows about this related to Jesus. We don't know how he got the story. Maybe he was part of the crowd's following. Somehow he knows. And he is willing to say, "I don't deserve for you to come. Just say the word." There's something he understood at a deeper level related to the authority of Jesus and Jesus' power to heal that a lot of the people around Jesus didn't get it. But this outsider got it. Now, there's a parallel incident in the Gospel of Luke. Remember Luke 4? Jesus is in the synagogue. He reads from the scroll from Isaiah. And he sits down, and it says all eyes are fastened on him. They're watching him. And then Jesus says something that no rabbi would ever have said in a synagogue after reading from the Old Testament scroll. "Today, this reading has been fulfilled in your hearing." Whoa, present day fulfillment? And Jesus claims it's him? Woo! Now, to make matters worse, he starts telling stories from Israel's history. Every single one of those are a non-Israelite. After a while, in Luke 4, they understand what he's doing, and they don't like it. They try to take him outside and throw him off the hill of the city, try to kill him, try to get rid of him. Jesus is constantly trying to broaden their perspective about the kingdom of God, and some people are not going to have it. Nope, 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 nope. We know who's in the kingdom, and that's it. And of course, no other religious group since being in the church has ever had that problem, but Jesus is trying to broaden their perspective of the work of the kingdom of God. Now, this centurion, because he's a Gentile, and we've noticed Jesus' question, his response is quite extraordinary, and at some level he understands Jesus' power and authority, as we mentioned. The power and authority of Jesus is displayed in a myriad of ways in the Gospel of Matthew. Even as we finish the Sermon on the Mount, notice that it says, that interesting comment, when he finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. The first thing that amazed them, because if Jesus is sort of functioning like a traditional rabbi ought to, well, then the rabbis knew who to quote. You know, they knew the rabbinic tradition, and anytime they were teaching, they knew who to quote as an authority. Jesus doesn't go back and quote other rabbis for authority. There's just something about the topics that he teaches, the way he teaches them, what he challenges audiences with. They knew that his teaching was different. They'd never heard anything else like it. And it's interesting, even with all of the written literature that we have from intertestamental period, later rabbinic period, there's nothing in Jewish writing that really approximates the Sermon on the Mount. So they heard something unique, and they knew it. So Jesus was amazed. And the next thing that comes to point here is when Jesus says, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Remember, we looked at 5 times in Matthew, this was earlier, where he calls his disciples, O you of little faith. Literally, you little faith ones. And Jesus had a hard time getting his disciples to see what he wanted them to see. And what you're going to find is, even though disciples, and we need to hear this, even though disciples can be individuals with little faith, Jesus is willing to work with us. What Jesus may be amazed at is sometimes when people get it at a level like this guy got it. Lord, I understand your power, your authority. Just speak the word and it'll happen. So it's such a great insight into the nature of faith and understanding who Jesus is. And like we mentioned earlier in verse 11, this is a reference to the inclusiveness of the kingdom. Verse 12 is interesting. We don't have time to develop verse 12. I think next week I'm going to talk a little bit about this expression, weeping and gnashing of teeth. It occurs, I think, 6 times in Matthew. Luke only has it once, and it's in a parallel passage that, with the Gospel of Matthew. And so we have to ask the question, what is going on in the Gospel of Matthew that makes it necessary for him to use this expression, and it's an idiom, of the weeping of gnashing of teeth? What does that mean? And why does it occur in the places that it does in the Gospel of Matthew? There's something going on. And next week we'll look at that. But it's a very critical insight into the idea of judgment. And Jesus is going to talk about commitment and what's going to happen to those who choose not to be disciples and remain uncommitted. So we'll look at the function of that phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, next week. Yeah, 6 times in Matthew. It's only once in Luke. The centurion's response, Jesus says, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." There's a dimension of faith that's interesting. It doesn't always occur in Matthew in every occasion. But Matthew doesn't want us to eliminate it in the life of a disciple. Sometimes, in order for things to happen, you have to believe that they can happen. Now think about that. And in order for God's will to unfold in our life as a disciple, we have to believe that that's what God wants done and commit ourselves to it. So it's a fascinating insight into a dimension of faith. And notice that Matthew's careful to record here, and his servant was healed at that moment. Wow, dramatic response to his belief. In 14 through 17, Jesus comes into Peter's house. His mother-in-law is very sick. She has fever. She's lying in bed with a fever. He touched her and the fever left her. It's interesting that only on one occasion of all of Jesus' miracles, there's one miracle that occurs that it's not quite instantaneous. Remember where he touches the gentleman and the guy says, can you see? He says, well, sort of, but I see people and they kind of look like trees. So, oh, okay. So Jesus does a second touch. That's fascinating. And people through the centuries have had all kinds of explanations of why he had to touch the man the second time. I don't know. But other than that, most all of his other miracles are presented as occurring on the spot. So that's what happened with Peter's mother-in-law. He touched her hand, the fever left her, so she gets up and she begins to wait on him. And of course that would have been the typical inviting Jesus into the house and hospitality in the home. Now notice the story shifts a little bit. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. If we have time next week too, I want to talk a little bit about this dynamic of being demon-possessed. It's interesting that throughout the history of the interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew, especially since the Age of Enlightenment, there have been a lot of Bible scholars who try to explain away demon possession. That there is an attempt to look at that phenomenon and say, well, we can figure out what kind of sickness that was. But it's interesting to me, the New Testament takes a different view of it. It's portrayed differently than that. Yeah, there are physical manifestations, and I'm not questioning that. But look at, and we'll dive more into this, demon possession, other than a couple times in the Old Testament, really doesn't come up. It's only when Jesus is fully engaged in his ministry in the Gospels that there's demon possession all over the place. And in every case where Jesus meets up with demon possession, he is able to cast out the demon. There's no situation in which the demon is stronger than Jesus. And that's interesting. And that's something we shouldn't overlook because that's pretty critical. And then, once the church starts, and you get into the you get into the book of Acts, I think there's only 1 or 2 references to demon possession in Acts, and then that's it. Because you don't read about it in Paul's letters or Peter's letters or the later letters of the New Testament. And it's almost like, I kind of use this illustration. You get a couple of blips in the Old Testament, then all of a sudden, whoa, here it is in Jesus' ministry. And then a couple of little more blips in the Acts, and it's over with. And you're like, what was that about? And so next week, I think one of the things that we want to do is dive into that phenomenon and say, okay, what was going on? Why did that happen predominantly during Jesus' ministry and no other time? So we'll look at that. Jesus is healing many. Some of them are demon-possessed. He drives out the spirits, and notice this is a demonstration of his power. He drove out the spirits with a word. Come out, I think is probably what the implication here is, because in other places where we have demon possession occurring and he speaks against it, he just says, come out. So probably what's meant here. And so he healed all of the sick. So with a word, his power, the spirits demon-possessed, they're cast out. And with a word, healing, words that's spoken, healing takes place. And all of this, remember this is earlier we talked about, Matthew likes to look at the ministry of Jesus on the framework of Old Testament fulfillment. It's almost like, if you can kind of think of like building a house, well, the Old Testament references of fulfillment are kind of like the studs in the wall. As he's building this picture of the ministry of Jesus, Jesus is aware of Old Testament prophecy, and at key points, Matthew makes sure that we as the reader understand that this is really important. Notice he says this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. And I discovered something in Isaiah, turn to 53, Isaiah 53, that really jumped out at me. Because we've already talked about it. I think it was last week we talked about it. Isaiah 53:4. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. And I've heard people read this passage on occasions before we get ready to take the Lord's Supper, and certainly very appropriate for that in terms of prophecy and fulfillment. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. So the quote comes from that text, and it's fascinating that in the Greek Old Testament, chapter 53, verse 5, he was crushed for our iniquities. It's the same word, anomia, or lawlessness, that we saw earlier in chapter 7. And this idea of lawlessness, I take it to be a contrast between one who understands the will of God and is ready to submit themselves to that. When we think of iniquity, we think more along the line, boy, that sounds really evil and terrible. What's the word? Onomatopoeia? That the word sounds kind of like what it is, like a bee can buzz, and so that's well, the word iniquity even sounds terrible, doesn't it? It may even be onomatopoeia. But iniquity, well, actually, the word is lawlessness, which means it's a mindset which finds itself in a way of life that basically says, I'm living any way I want to. You know, you can't tell me how to live. And besides that, if I'm going to create or if I'm going to be religious, I'm going to do it on my own terms. So it's living life on your own terms. Sometimes the way it's used both in the Old and New Testament, it's with the implication, I'm living life on my own terms with the veneer of religion so it looks kind of good. And that's like, Jesus like, no, that's not it at all. And so it's interesting that this passage, quoted from Isaiah 53, uses, he was crushed for our lawlessness. The mindset that we can just live any way we want to. It's up to us. Jesus died to get rid of that kind of mindset. And if we understand that, and Matthew understood it, whoa. You begin to see now at a deeper level, discipleship's not about me. It's about turning my life over to Jesus and following him. That's the core of discipleship. And that's why it's so critical that we pick up on these ideas of discipleship as we go through the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, we got just enough time. Let's look at some practical applications to our faith then, of what we've seen in Matthew chapter 8, 1 through 17. The willingness of Jesus to respond to our needs. That is part of a cornerstone of discipleship. Now, how willing Jesus is and to what particular needs, I don't know. That may be as individual as each disciple. But part of just the cornerstone of the good news is Jesus' willingness to respond to our needs. Second one, the healing touch of Jesus. We talked about this, that it's appropriate in our response to others' needs, that we touch people's lives by interacting with their needs, but also an appropriate touch on the shoulder or coming up to someone, holding their hand or whatever. Jesus had a ministry with a high degree of physical touch in appropriate ways because he knew something about that healing touch. Lord, I do not deserve. Remember that? But his acceptance of the Lord's grace, though he didn't deserve it. Well, every one of us stands squarely right where that centurion did. We understand the power and authority of Jesus. We don't deserve it, but we accept it. And the authority of Jesus in my life, I love it where the centurion says, Lord, just say the word. And that's our attitude. Lord, just say the word. That's what I'm going to follow. That is amazing and astounding. Well, thank you for being here this morning, and we will pick up. I think next week I want to do two things. I want to look at this weeping and gnashing of teeth in the Gospel of Matthew, and then I want to look at the phenomenon of demon possession. So we'll cover those two next week. Thank you all for being here.